The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 7th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. This is an extended reading, so it's more than what's on the back of the bulletin. From there, Jesus arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know. Yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth. And she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first. For it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." He said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed, and the demon gone. Jesus returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. And they brought him to a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. And they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears. And after spitting, touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephrata," that is, be opened. And his ears were opened. His tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, "He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. Well, as there appear to be no children here, we won't have a children's sermon. I'll show them. First, let's start with just a bit of geography. It seems Mark has Jesus wandering all over the place. He has him go to Tyre and then Sidon, which is further north, and then go home to the Decapolis, which is on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. So he's moving north and south and all over the place before he gets back to Israel. And I think the reason for that is not that Mark didn't know much about the geography of Israel and Lebanon, but I think it was just simply Jesus was trying to get away. Now, I've heard a lot of people here saying they've gotten away this summer, and so we know what it's like. Sometimes you just need to get away, to break the patterns of your behavior. And then Jesus was true God, but he was also true man, and needed a break. And so he begins the gospel lesson today, the extended one that I just read, by traveling north out of Israel, I guess figuring that maybe he'll have a little peace and quiet there and can recharge his batteries with just his friends with him. But, let's admit some things. One of the things we could admit, before there was electricity, before there were computers and TV and radio, life could be boring. If you were a farmer here, 150 years ago, there wasn't a lot to do. There really wasn't. Couldn't do much farming before the dam was built and irrigation either, but there really wasn't much to do. And the people in Israel and Lebanon and Syria and other places had not much to do. And so when they would hear something, that someone special was coming, they would turn out just to see. One of the things we know about kings and queens, when they would approach, they would have a long parade. You'd need a couple trumpeters. I've been over to London and seen the army riding horses through the streets of London, pulling caissons with little, 1812 cannons behind them, riding down the cobblestone streets with at that time it was the Queen, now I'm sure it's the King, riding in a carriage behind them. Oh, wonderful stuff and very grand. And even today, it's impressive. But if you were living in a house made out of mud and farming with a stick to break the soil, seeing someone come by with a long parade was really impressive. And so when they hear this great prophet is coming to town, it's hard to hide. Because even though he told his disciples, keep it quiet, and he does that by the end of today's gospel lesson, people still want to talk. And so he can't hide. He can't get away from his fame. And this woman shows up. Now, a couple things about this woman. And first, I want to start by looking at the beginning of chapter 7. We've read that for a couple weeks. The beginning of chapter 7, we start with Jesus' disciples walking along, and they're hungry, so they start to eat. And the people around them say, wait a minute, they're not washing their hands. They're not following the traditions. And Jesus says, the traditions, they're good in and of themselves, but they're not the essence. And if people are hungry, let them eat. It seems pretty simple. Sure, if you have water and you wash your hands, that's a good thing. Think of some of our traditions. They're good things. Whether it's this congregation or a denomination, we have the liturgy, and it gives us a pattern of worship. And that's a good thing. Even if you go to a church, I have a friend who's a Southern Baptist pastor. If you go to his church, he says they don't have a liturgy. No, but they do the same thing in the same order every week. That's a liturgy. They don't call it that, but that's what it is. Liturgy just means it's the people's work. And so it's the way the people prepare to worship God. That's all it means. And so if you get the liturgy wrong, well, you've got many weeks to come to get it right. It's not the be-all and end-all. And I love the liturgy. I like fancy stuff. If you ever happen to be in New York City, I'm going to recommend, if you're in Midtown and you want an experience of a different type of church, right near Times Square, there's an Episcopal church. I think they burn a pound of incense a week. It's called Smoky Mary's, St. Mary the Virgin, Smoky Mary's. You can go there. They have a service you wouldn't believe. You can see them online if you really want to check it out. And that's fine. I've been there once. It was enough for me. And if you go, and probably once would be enough, or maybe you'd decide, that's what worship should be. That's fine. But the tradition of washing your hands should not replace God's love of his people, saying, if you're hungry, eat. If it's not good for man to be alone, I'll give him someone to be with him. God's saying that the traditions, whatever you've done, they're all good, but, it's about his love for people that matters. And so we go from God's grace, saying that it's okay for the disciples to eat. Then we go to more. By verse 19, we have Jesus doing another healing and saying that it's okay. And all foods are clean. Everything is clean because it's not what's out there that's the sin. It's what's inside. And today we get a lesson that's connected to that. Both halves of it, both miracles, I think, are connected to that. It's what's inside that counts. This Syrophoenician woman. First, a Jewish man does not talk to a woman. And a Jewish man doesn't talk to a Gentile unless absolutely necessary. In New Jersey, where I was, we lived just north of the town of Lakewood. And if you went to Lakewood, occasionally someone would talk to me. But I could count on it. If I stuck out my hand to shake someone's hand, they wouldn't shake my hand. The men might. The women certainly wouldn't. It was unclean. I was unclean. Yeah, I survive. But that's the way their tradition was and is. That they have to make themselves ritually pure. Foods and all have to be pure. And so today this woman who's not a Jew comes to Jesus and he greets her and he talks to her. It's already a scandal. He shouldn't be doing that, but he did it. He was on vacation, but I suspect he would have done it anyway because he was good for breaking rules. Those of us who like rules should remember that. Jesus was great at breaking the rules, saying they didn't matter. That what was important was spreading the good news that God was in love with all his children. That's the essence of the faith. And the rules, however important they are not the essence of the church. The essence. What's at stake between Jesus and this woman now in their conversation is the relationship of her Syro-Phoenician background to his Judaism. It's not right to take the food for the children and give it to dogs. Now, someone calls your family a dog, what's your response going to be? I agree. It's probably not your response. Who are you calling a dog? That would be the normal response, but would that have gotten anything from Jesus? Maybe, maybe not. But if you're asking him for something, you better roll with what he's saying and not stand up and argue with him. You know, if you go for a job interview, don't argue with the interviewer. It's not a good way to get a job. Really isn't. The last church I served got a call list. 3 of the pastors, when they called them up, the head elder called them up to see if they wanted to be interviewed. 3 of them, when they heard a woman's voice saying, I'm the head elder, were already saying, I don't want to be at your church. And they said, fine, we don't want you here. It's a good way to weed them out. You know, as soon as you hear the voice, you're ready to fight. You're not getting it. And she had a daughter who was sick. She needed Jesus or someone or something. And so today she goes with it. He says it's not fair to take the food that belongs to the children and give it to the dogs. And she says, yeah, but even the dogs can get a crumb if it falls from the table. If the children drop it and the dog comes over and gets it, wouldn't that be enough? My daughter is sick. It's not what comes out of her is sinful. In this case, what comes out of her is a statement of faith. I know that even a crumb falling from your table will be sufficient for my daughter. It's that faith. And he looks at her and says, go home. Your child is cured. Now, the second miracle, he has to touch people and do things. But in his first miracle, just say, go home. The demon is gone, never to return. Go home. It's done. What has come out of her is the faith, and God responds with grace, with love. People who try to draw the distinctions and say, well, she's a Syro-Phoenician and you're a Jew. People who try that sort of stuff, you know, it's like we have grace and we've got to hold it in. We've got the message and we can't let too many people in and thus they do things. We do that too. You know, we baptize children when they're 2 weeks old, but we won't give them communion until they are 13 or 14 in this church. In New Jersey, the rules were different. But in this church, 13 or 14, we have rules. Got to meet the criteria. Jesus is saying it's not necessary. Now, I'm not here to say your rules are wrong. Most Missouri Synod churches follow that rule. I'm just saying that not all do. And if you're somewhere and you see something different, follow the rule my mother taught me. If you go to someone's house for dinner and they serve dinner on paper plates, don't look at them and say, well, we use china. When you're in their house, you say thank you. And you roll with it. And so when Jesus is dealing with this woman and she's willing to accept the insult and still run with it, that's good enough. Her faith has convinced Jesus that he should do this miracle for her, and her daughter is healed. Building a wall, whatever that wall is, keeps Jesus and the sick apart. The grace of God is not something like a treasure that we have to guard against spending, because if we spend it, it'll be gone. The grace of God is something greater. It's more like a candle. You know, on Christmas Eve, when you light the candles, I start with one candle. I give someone light. That doesn't diminish my candle. It doubles it. And they give someone, and I give someone else, and it doubles and doubles and doubles, and pretty soon the whole church is lit. The grace of God grows with love. It isn't constrained by any of the rules. Jesus ignored most of them. And we should be welcoming to them. Now, there are rules, and we all have them. All of us have some bias or prejudice of one sort or another. I met a girl once when I was in St. Louis, and I met more than one, but this one time I'm thinking about. She was from, I don't remember, Minnesota, Dakota, somewhere, from a dairy farm. That's my experience with farmers before I came here. I never saw her father's farm, but I knew her. And she told me, I don't understand people, you have riots, race riots in the city. And I said, well, we don't want them, but they come along. And people have they have to protect their turf. People are very, concerned about their own little protection. It's not a good thing, but that's it. And she said, well, I've met black people, and they're wonderful. They're not like those Indians. I said, well, it's just a different prejudice. Just a different prejudice. That's all it is. We all have prejudices of one sort or another. In this town, it might be Mexicans. I don't know. It's probably not African Americans, because there aren't enough of them here to be angry at them. It just won't work. We all have prejudices, and Jesus is dealing with a society where the prejudice was Jew and non-Jew. And because of her faith, he transcends that prejudice. That rule goes by the wayside. The grace of God grows as we share it. When we express love to people, whoever they are, wherever they are, the grace of God is growing, and his love is being spread to all sorts of people. When I think of Jesus, let me think about a doctor. Man goes to the doctor and says, Doc, I'm not feeling good. And the doctor does all sorts of examinations and says, doesn't look good. He says, am I dying, Doc? And the doctor says, yeah, you are. He said, well, how long do I have? The doctor looks at him and says, 10. The man says, 10 what? 10 months? 10 years? And the doctor says, 9. 8. 7. How long do you have with Jesus? The time is coming. We are called to spread God's love. The time is coming. We don't hold it back. That's not the way for the gospel of Jesus Christ to be spread in the world. The time is coming. We have to let what we have inside out. Similarly, the second half, the second miracle, when Jesus finds the man they bring to him the man who's deaf and can't speak, and Jesus puts some mud and puts it on his ear and says, be opened, Ephrata, not Ephrata, that's a different word, but Ephrata, be opened. The man's ears are opened. And he's able to speak. And again, what comes out of him now is what he has received from God. That grace that God has been given to him is now expressed and comes out. Just as we receive from God, and we have received from God, in years of Sunday school and confirmation and coming to church and listening to sermons and everything else, in years like that, we have received a lot from God, but not to hold it in. But like that man born deaf, let it out. To express the love of God that he has for us and express it to other people and give thanks and praise. That's what we're called to do. Spread God's love to other people, spread his grace, and give him thanks and praise. Not a difficult message, but it is difficult to put into practice. Very difficult. Jesus declared all foods to be clean. He declared that he could talk to a woman who wasn't related to him. He declared that he could talk to a Gentile. He declared that she and her confession was the true faith and trust in God. He could do all of those things. He could even say that you and I are part of his church, part of the bride of Christ, part of his family. And then he can say, now take what you've received and let it out. Don't hold it back. The healing of the man changed what was in him and allowed it to come out. Now, before I go too far astray, I want to go on a little tangent here. The imperative that Jesus uses in this Ephrata, be opened, he uses one other time in the Gospels. And that's where he says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Many people hear that and say, oh, I've got to be perfect. Any less than perfect and Jesus won't love me. That's not what he's saying. Grammatically, he's saying the same thing. He is declaring the man able to hear, and the man is able to hear. He is declaring that you're perfect. You're still a sinner, but you're now perfect in the eyes of God because of his sacrifice. Be perfect. Be open. And back to the main point, the gospel today. Be open. In many churches, and usually not till October, but in many churches, this is the season for stewardship sermons. So let me go there. Be open. Be open. You know, a lot of churches, stewardship means the church council sits down and says, okay, how much do we have to spend next year? How are we going to raise that amount? That's not stewardship. That's meeting the budget. A virtue all to itself. Surely. I like that my check doesn't bounce. It's virtuous. But that's not stewardship. Stewardship is saying, what have I got locked up inside of me that I have received from God? What do I have that's more than I need? Let me give it out. Let me let it go. How can I express my gratitude to God for what he has done by giving of myself? And there are all sorts of ways to do that. And one of them is money. Now, I can preach about you should give more money because, you know, I'm not going to be here. It's not the, you know, if you got Pastor Lap now preaching that a year or two ago, you say, well, yeah, you want to preach that because you want to raise. I'm not going to be here. I don't want or need a raise. I'm preaching because it's for you. It's not good to hold it in. Not good at all. I can remember in one of my churches, we had a couple and they were always talking about how they lived on a fixed income. And, you know, I'm not saying they were wealthy. They certainly weren't poor. They lived very well. But fixed income? How many of you are on Social Security? I am. What did I get last year? 8% raise? 6% raise? And they're telling me 3%, 3.2% this year. I wish it was 8% again, but it won't be. That's not a fixed income. It's not. whatever you're holding in you, don't treasure the money or anything else so much, or your time. Don't treasure it so much that you're not willing to give it and share it. And not necessarily to the church. Certainly you should give enough so that this church can grow and prosper. I think that's a given. But you should give elsewhere too. I had a parishioner who was a very wealthy man, the wealthiest one I've ever had in the parish. He gave a third of the church budget. And I know he also gave the same amount to Concordia Milwaukee, because that's where he went to school. And I know he gave to other charities. And he always told me too. Plus, when we needed a new roof, he gave us the money for a new roof. He said, you don't need a fund drive. Here's some money. Very generous man. Whatever I wanted, he said, just let me know. He gave me a stack of coupons for his restaurants. People come to the church and they say they're hungry, give them $20 or $40 gift certificates. Let them eat. Very generous man. More than that, he gave his time. He was a very busy man. He had over 5,000 employees. And if I called him up that we needed him at the church for something, he came. Now, maybe not right away. He might say, oh, I'm in Albany tomorrow or something. But he would be there, giving his time, giving his advice. And I especially valued his advice because he was a good businessman. It started from nothing and built this business with 5,000 employees. He was a good businessman. And so when he came to the church and said, I think we should do this, that, and the other thing, it was usually the best course of action to follow him and not to the guys who were broke. Don't follow their advice, follow his. Just as a point of information, just do that. The former director of the National Council of Churches Stewardship, Norton Murphy, said part of the problems that many pastors have with congregations is they don't talk to people about what it means to be a giving person in your family. Now, you might, if you're married, people frequently get used to each other and start taking each other for granted. Being a giving person certainly means sharing whatever wealth you have. Don't have separate money. That's my money. You keep your hands off my money. That's not good for a marriage. But it also means sharing your time. Don't say, I'm going out with my buddies. Once in a while, that's okay. Last week I was down in Redmond. On Tuesday, my wife has a continuing education class at one of the colleges, and after that she goes with some of the people who are also retired and taking continuing education. They go and they have lunch every Tuesday. That's fine. But if you're doing that every day, if you're never home because you've got important things with other people and you're never home, well, then you got to look at your relationship. There are values here that you've got to share with one another. Time is one of them. Just being together. Taking a vacation together. Not always. My wife went on a vacation years ago with two of her nieces and her sister-in-law, and they went to Paris, the four women. I didn't want to go. Just let you know. Wasn't a threat to me that she went on vacation by herself. But most vacations we're with each other, and that's a good thing. I went on a vacation with one of my seminary roommates, and we were over. They were rebuilding Salisbury Cathedral and a number of churches over in England, and we went to look at the architecture and the guys who were doing the artwork and all that. She didn't want to go. So she didn't mind that I didn't insist that she go with me. That was fine by her. But most of the time we're together. We spend time. That's an important part of a marriage, and it's an important part of a church, to spend time with each other, and also all our gifts. Money, time, our abilities to do things, these are all important. That's what being a disciple of Christ is about. letting these things out. If you don't encourage people to do these things, the pastor is not being honest with his congregation, because that's how we grow in the faith. We grow in the faith. Now, there are pastors and there are lay people who, they do like the faith, and they like their spouse, but they want to take some time by themselves. Like I said, that's okay sometimes, not all the time. Man goes golfing all the time. Let's say he's a pastor, but one Sunday morning he really doesn't want to go preach. He has seen the same faces every Sunday for 10 years. He really just doesn't think he can do it today. So he calls up the head elder and says, "I'm sick, I can't make it. I don't know what you can do." He goes golfing. God and the angels are up in heaven, and the angels say, "You're going to let him get away with that?" And God says, "Oh, I got a punishment for him." Guy gets up to the first tee, hits the ball, hole in one. Great. Goes to the second tee, hits it, another hole in one. The angel looks and says, "I thought you were going to punish him." He says, "I am. It's going to kill him that he can't tell anyone." God has given us many gifts. He has given us to use in his service. And today, I encourage you to do just that. And look to the model of our Lord himself, who gave himself, all of himself. What does St. Paul say in Philippians? He was equal to God, but didn't count it a sacrifice at all, to give all of that up, to come down and be with creation, be with you and me, to be with us, and even to go and suffer humiliation and death on the cross, to give everything, to empty himself out. And he did it willingly and gladly because of his love for us and all of his people. We are called to follow him. We don't have to save the world, but we can follow him to his cross and to ours, and to his resurrection and ours. Amen.